$1 billion. That is not a bad annual surplus for a university to make, especially during the second year of a global pandemic. But when the University of Sydney released their 2021 annual report back in April, that's exactly what they had made. So let's take a look at not only how that happened, but also put it into historical context. This was not the video I had originally intended. I had wanted to put out a video covering the financials of the group of 8 universities. But given a number of them are still to release their 2021 figures, I thought I'd take this opportunity to take a deeper dive with the University of Sydney. Okay, so whilst we know that they made a pretty healthy surplus in 2021, it is important to put that into context. And yes, as is pretty obvious from this graphic, the 2021 surplus is substantially larger than what they've recorded previously. Their average surplus in the 20 previous years was $133 million, with their previous record surplus of $248 million occurring in 2013. So yes, 2021 was drastically different. But why? Well, and apologies for going all a bit accounting 101, but profit, or in this case a surplus, is the difference between revenues and expenses. For profits to increase, revenues need to go up, expenses need to go down, or in the case of the University of Sydney, both at the same time. From 2001 through to 2019, revenues and expenses moved together on a pretty steady upward trend. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, they continued to move together, but unsurprisingly, going backwards as the pandemic started to bite. As we moved to 2021, expenses continued to decline. However, revenues went up a lot. Before looking at what changes took place, it's useful to understand about how Australian universities generate revenue and what it costs them to do so. In terms of revenue generation, there are 3 main revenue streams: Australian government grants, primarily to support research, Commonwealth-supported students, and fee-paying students, either international students or domestic postgrads. These generally account for about 75% of university revenue. In terms of expenses, staff costs are far and away the biggest, accounting for about 60% of total expenses. The next largest, and this would be of no surprise for those in the sector, are expenses related to non-current assets, things like depreciation, maintenance, and impairment charges, and this accounts for about 10%. So with that in mind, what happened at the University of Sydney in 2021? From the revenue side of things, there were 3 key drivers for the increase in 21. First, they majorly bucked the national trend in terms of fees and charges. Whereas most other universities that I've looked at saw decreases in fees and charges in 21 as compared to 2020, the University of Sydney had a $260 million increase to $1.48 billion. That's a 21% increase. Second, they received $832 million in Australian government grants. This was a 22% or $152 million increase on 2020. The third and most significant was the $566 million in investment-related revenue. This was a whopping $496 million increase on 2020, driven in part by the market bounce back in 2020, but it also saw major effects from the return on sale of IDP Limited, which a number of the other universities were involved with, as well as having over 100 hectares of land acquired by the Transport for New South Wales and Sydney Water. So yes, arguably much of the positive revenue effect may be a one-off, but even if we strip out the investment-related revenues, all of it, it's still noticeable that 21 was different. Turning to the expenses side of things, a number of things are going on. First, there was a major reduction in externally sourced services through both 2020 and 2021, from $152 million in 2019 to $118 million in 2020 to $85 million in 2021. Second, expenses related to non-current assets declined from $351 million in 2019 to $329 million in 2020 and then $310 million in 2021. Impairments were taken in 21 and 2020, but more than offset by reductions in depreciation and amortization. Third, and probably most contentious, employee costs initially went up $74 million in 2020 before declining by $59 million in 2021. While the largest line item dollar change, it was only a 3.9% decrease on 2020 staff costs. And lastly, the largest increase in expenses was a $46 million or 38% increase to teaching and research grants in 2021. Whilst we've had a look at what happened in 21, it's also useful to put the last 20 years in context in relation to key revenue items. This first graph effectively compares fee-paying student revenue to domestic Commonwealth-supported student revenue. My starting point is 2001, at which point these amounts weren't that different. 118 million for fee-paying revenue and 104 million for Commonwealth-supported students. Apart from a slight blip in 2009 for domestic students, and then a flattening out through the mid-2010s, Commonwealth-supported student revenue has grown at an annualized 5.66% over the last 21 years. For fee-paying students, there have been 3 periods here. From 2001 to 2011. During this period of time, annual revenue increased 11.3% per annum from $117 million a year to $373 million a year. The second period, 2011 to 2019, saw an annual revenue increase of 18.3% per annum from $373 million to $1.22 billion. And the third period, post-2019, this is the COVID era, which we saw an initial decline in revenue before an increase to $1.48 billion. For the next graph, I'm going to keep fees and charges, but now compare it to Australian government grant revenue. At the start of the period in question, government grants at $327 million were nearly 3 times the $117 million earned from fees and charges. Over the next 11 years, government grant revenue grew at 8.01% per annum to $761 million in 2012. Over the next years through to 2020, government grant revenue actually declined at 1.4% per annum to $680 million before jumping to $832 million as previously noted. Why this decline? I'm not close enough to the detail to say, but would love to hear what you think though. What this means is that over the past 20 years, the revenue mix for the University of Sydney has changed markedly. In 2001, just under 14% of the revenue was fees and charges, with government grant revenue being just over 38%. 20 years later, grant revenue only makes up 24% of the University of Sydney's revenue, whilst fees and charges about 42%. If you've made it this far, thank you again for watching. I hope you found it useful, and if you'd like to stay notified of my future work, including the combined group of 8, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell. Cheers.